Good evening, everyone. Just while we wait for other people to enter, I put on the new words that we should have learnt last week that we can add to our list of all the new words that will be good for your creative writing. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this task just while we wait for other people to enter. And then we'll go through them in about 2, 3 minutes time. But have a go at these just for a few minutes whilst we wait. Right, okay, we'll make a proper start. There's not as many of you this week. I'm wondering if things are happening. And it's been really, well, I was going to say it's been really sunny, but it's terrible today, isn't it, with all the rain? Okay, so I hope you've had a think about these. We should have begun to start learning these now. As I said last week, and as I keep repeating to you, it's never a bad thing to expand your vocabulary. So right, I'll put on the answers. Mark which ones you have got right. So the magician handed her a small, strange-looking talisman, claiming it would bring her good luck. So remembering from last week, a talisman is sort of a magical object believed to have powers, basically, that should bring somebody luck and protection, and are often used in supernatural novels. You might see them in fantasy films and stuff like that. Despite the danger, the doughty firefighter entered the burning building to save the trapped family. So someone who is doughty is brave and determined, which very much fits the situation. The mouse was scurrying across the floor, trying to escape the cat's attention. So think about the context of this. Scurrying is sort of moving with really quick, hurried movements, which makes sense, considering the mouse's fear towards the cat as the mouse is predator, prey is prey to the cat as the predator. So she smiled amiably at the new student, hoping to make him feel welcome. So if you do something amiably, this is that adverb. You do something in a friendly sort of way. And we discussed last week that you can use this as an adjective as well. So if you were to say someone is amiable, you'd be saying that they are friendly. But if they're doing something amiably, they are doing something in a friendly way. Okay, and the horror film relied on sudden noises to provoke the audience. So if you're trying to provoke someone, and it's not necessarily just relating to films, you can provoke somebody as well. And it would be to deliberately try and upset them. He stared grimly at the broken toy as if it had ruined his entire day. Often we describe the weather as being quite grim. For example, if it was a really cloudy day, you might say it's quite grim, making it sound very gloomy and serious, or at least something that's very unpleasant. So if he stared grimly, he stared at something unpleasantly or with some sort of negative connotation. The light was pulsating from the speaker, changing colors to the beat of the music. So think of pulses. What else pulses? Our veins around our body. The heart pumps blood, and so you get this pulse, and that's sort of the beating. So we can think of pulsating as being some sort of beat or in a rhythmic way. The soldier crept forward in a stealthy way, caring not to make a sound. So I think of like people who are stealthy do stuff in quite a secretive and quiet way. They do stuff trying not to be noticed. So makes sense with the soldier at war. Wouldn't want to provoke the enemy. Her credulity made her believe the prank call was real, even though it was clearly a joke. So if you have credulity, you have a sort of tendency to believe things without proof. So you could describe someone as potentially gullible. So it's a lovely alternative to using the word gullible, this more higher level grade 8, 9 word. They listened apathetically to the teacher's explanation, showing no interest at all. So if they're showing no interest, it suggests they're not enthusiastic, they don't care about what the teacher has to say. So if you're apathetic, you don't care, essentially. And a sudden fusillade of gunfire erupted from the trees, causing the troops to dive for cover. We use fusillade specifically for war because it relates to gunfire. So if you have a continuous series of shots or explosions or relating to an attack, you could say it is a fusillade, which unfortunately is all too prevalent for what's going on in the world at the minute. Okay. But this week, as per requested, and I said last week I was going to take requests, what people wanted to do. And I've been asked to cover how to write essays, specifically looking at thesis statements, but I thought thesis statements are kind of part of writing a wider essay. So let's just do the whole thing. Let's go back to basics and really talk about step by step what you should include in an essay. Okay. Right, but firstly, let's really dig down. What actually is an essay? So an essay is a structured piece of writing. Now, this doesn't mean that it's necessarily limited to writing. For example, if I was to write a speech, I could say that is an essay because I've technically written it, even if I'm going to speak it later. But it's anything that is structured or has your thoughts kind of organized in a structured way. It is used to present an argument of some sort, either that or an idea or to analyze a piece of text. And we'll look in a second at the different types of essays. But they have to include some sort of reasoning or evidence to your argument. You can't just make a point and not follow it through. You have to be able to provide evidence as to your opinion or reasoning to something. But why do we actually write essays in the first place? Well, I guess it's to show understanding of a topic. I mean, in schools, you write essays all the time, more so in English literature and English language, but in other subjects as well. And if you are to take subjects to a higher level past GCSE, you will find that you end up writing more essays, especially later down the line. And we do so because it's a good way of getting your opinion across about something or um, presenting maybe scientific data to somebody or advancements in whatever field you're talking about. So it's a good way of structuring something to interest people, to help them understand what is going on within a specific field. And it's also to develop thinking and writing skills. So whether that's for exams or whether that's beyond. So like I said last week, I encourage you, if you want to send me something, I will happily mark it, whatever essays. I've had a few essays come to me recently, and I'm happy to mark whatever you need me to mark. But why are they actually important? Well, firstly, they help you think better, if nothing else. Our brains are constantly developing, especially you guys at a younger age. And so it might be helpful to you to start practicing writing more essays, helping your neurons start to form, because it helps you organize your thoughts clearly. I know a lot of people nowadays with social media, we lose focus quite often. We're kind of stuck in this world where we're never really asked to really put our attention to something. And so writing an essay is quite a good way of really just trying to structure your brain and organize it. Give yourself sort of a rigid pattern and therefore try to organize your thoughts clearly. It also helps to maybe like develop your ideas, get better at creative thinking, thinking out of the box, which is a good transferable skill for later life. You know, even if the hard skill of writing essays isn't necessarily applicable to what you want to do, writing essays will help you develop the softer skills. So creative thinking and critical analysis, all these things that will come very useful to you later in life with whatever you do. And it helps you learn to build arguments. So, for example, I was a scientist for many years. It was what my degree was in. And I've used many of the skills that essay writing has taught me. So, critical analysis, I've used countless times, more than I can think of. Organization skills, just being able to present an argument in a logical and engaging way will really help for whatever you do later down the line. So they prepare you for the future, whether that's GCSE exams, whether that's A-level exams, or whether that's beyond. And they're not just for English. They are useful in every subject. As I said, I did science. So I was often asked to present data or research in a logical way. History, very prevalent to write essays. Even your more sort of like mathematical sciences, there will be some sort of essay writing. And it helps you build, as I said, these soft skills for college and university and your real life careers. So that's organization or I was going to say teamwork, but any sort of soft skills like that. And they make you a better writer. They improve your grammar, your vocabulary, and your structure, which is important, especially for your upcoming exams, because you will get marked on your SPAG, your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Essays don't always have to be formal either, but they do help you to develop and understand different academic styles. So whether that's writing speeches, like I said before, which tend to be more engaging, or whether it's research theses, where you end up having to organize past research in a logical way. So therefore, they help you to learn and communicate with clarity, and not just clarity, but with purpose. Because the reason we write essays is we want to get a point across, an opinion. So they are very important. And I cannot stress soft skills enough. If you don't know what soft skills are, go and research, because there are so many transferable skills that will come useful in your life. Okay, but let's look at the types of essays, because there are different ones. So firstly, an argumentative essay, or if something is persuasive. What we're trying to do with those types of essays is to convince the reader, or if it's a speech, the audience of something. So the example that I've used is the school uniform should be banned. It's in that situation, it would be my imperative, my goal to convince the audience or the reader that my point is correct. So that would be argumentative. So we're not necessarily taking the other side into account in those kind of situations. Discursive. So this is where you do explore multiple sides of the issue. So for example, I said, is social media more helpful or harmful? Well, in this kind of scenario, I would want to answer for both sides and then end up coming up with my own opinion at the end based on all of the evidence. So discursive, you will often find if you start to do scientific careers later down the line, discursive essays will come up a lot, because you might be asked whether current understanding of research is important, or if it's still relevant. And then you might have to argue both sides. If there's better ways we could be doing something, or maybe not. It could be an ethical issue, could be discursive. I won't get into ethics here, but ethical issues are discursive. We also have analytical. So the goal of analytical essays, and these are the ones that you find mostly in your GCSE English, because what they aim to do is examine either something about a text, a theme, or a character closely. So, for example, I said, how does Shakespeare present ambition in Macbeth? So if something was analytical, you will often find these all over your GCSE literature. So Inspector Calls, it could be, how is Sheila presented as a subversive woman of the time? Could be something like that. So you've got to look out for those how to or how does something will be analytical. And with these kind of essays, again, you're kind of expected to explore both sides of the argument and then come up with your own judgment at the end based on all the evidence. And then finally, we have expository. So these aim to explain an idea or process clearly. And these are more related to, again, for example, our science sort of essays. So GCSE, A-level, even going on to university levels. It might just be write as much of what you know about one subject. So the example I gave here is, how does recycling help the environment? There's no debate involved in this question. It's purely looking for factual bits of information and everything you want, everything you know about a subject. So I put a question at the bottom. Which type of essay do you think is most challenging and why? And I would like you to go have a think about this. You don't have to answer me now. But I think as we go through this, have a think. And I'm hoping that what we go through today might help you out a little bit. Okay. Okay, when it comes to basic essay structure then, we always start with an introduction. And this is sort of the short paragraph at the beginning that introduces the reader into the topic. And we'll go through these sort of in more specifics in a minute, but the first part of an introduction is the hook. The role of an introduction, especially in our modern day age where people can't concentrate properly, to have quite low attention spans, it is so important to hook the reader. You want them to make sure they read on. You want them to read on. So we need to have some sort of hook, and we'll cover this in a second. Also in the introduction, we tend to cover sort of the brief background or context of a subject, followed by, and this is what people have asked me to write about, our thesis statement. And this should be followed. I mean, the introduction should really only be about 20%, 10, 20% of an essay. It shouldn't be a large proportion. But what should be a large proportion is our main body, or the paragraphs. And when it comes to sort of English literature, you're looking 3-4 paragraphs. If it's a speech of some sort, maybe a bit longer. If it's a more formal piece of writing, maybe only 2-3. But each paragraph within your main body should include a topic sentence, which is the main point, evidence, and we'll go through this as well, quotes, examples, facts, and then explanation as to how you can link that piece of evidence to support your wider points. And end with a linking sentence. So making sure to always link back to the question so that you can show the examiner exactly, that you know exactly what you're talking about. Okay. So we also then finally have a conclusion, and this should really only be 5% of your total essay structure. It's not the most important, but it does really round out the essay. So the role of a conclusion is to summarize the main points, restating almost your thesis from the introduction, and ending with a final thought. You want to leave the reader with something that they can go away and really think about. And hopefully you will have encouraged them to think in a certain way. And as a top tip, always refer back to the question. So I left this linking sentence at the end of the body paragraphs. It's super important to always link back to the question, because especially in exams, because you need to show the examiner that you know exactly what you're talking about and you've been relevant to the question. Okay, before we explore those in detail, let's go over the writing process. Because good essays don't start with the writing. You know, in an exam, there's a reason that they give you 5-10 minutes of planning time, because planning is vital, you know, because good essays do not start with writing, they start with thinking. And in 5 key steps, we'll explore this. So firstly, understanding the question. It's so vital to make sure that you know exactly what is being asked of you in the question, because otherwise you're going to be writing something completely irrelevant or off the track, which means you're going to lose marks, you're going to lose the engagement of the reader. If this was your career, you're going to be called in for a disciplinary meeting. It's not good to misunderstand the question. And then from there, once you've gained the understanding, we start brainstorming ideas, being able to pick everything out that we could write about, and then start to think how we're going to organize and layer our argument so that it builds nicely in a sort of legible and understandable and breathable way. And then writing a draft, because the draft should never be the final essay. And I know in exams, obviously that's kind of a done deal, because you can't really write a draft in an exam. But when it comes to other things, so speeches and scientific writing, the first draft is never the final, because there's always improvements to be made. So rushing to write without planning is always just going to lead to a confused essay. So always take the time to plan. Okay. So understanding the question then, what does that actually mean? The way that I would understand the question, and I would implore you to please do this in your English literature exams so that you know exactly what you're talking about. So I would highlight all the keywords first and foremost, making sure that you know exactly what it is that the examiner or the exam board is asking of you. Specifically making sure you understand the focus of the question, so you're keeping things relevant. And are you fully answering the question? So the way to do this is in the exam, you'll have seen all of these. And so I think teachers need to teach this because when I was in school, teachers did not go over this. But each of these words that they could give you in an exam mean different things. So firstly, if you see the word discuss in a question, what the examiner wants of you is to give a balanced view. They want you to explore both sides of the argument, but ultimately end with your own judgment. So I think I gave the question a few slides ago about how important recycling is. Well, there are always pros and cons to everything on this earth. Nothing is totally good and nothing is totally bad. Obviously, recycling is a good thing, but there are always some sort of cons to it, and it wants a balanced view. However, at the end, I would be expected in my conclusion to say, however, I believe the recycling is good. If it says evaluate, again, very similar, weighing up strengths and weaknesses. So again, giving a final judgment at the end of it. Analysis, or if it wants you to analyze something, it wants to break down. So this is one that you might see in your English literature if it tells you to, or you will see this, I hope, in Macbeth and Jekyll and Hyde. It will give you an extract from a scene or a chapter within the texts. And it should ask you to fully analyze that bit of text. And when it asks you to do that, it means really dig in to the choice of words, to the choice of techniques, and understand why the writer has done or chosen the choices that they've made. So really breaking it down, looking closely at how something works. Explain. So if it asks you to explain, it wants you to make something clear. Say how or why something happens. So it could be explain how Lady Macbeth is presented as an ambitious woman within the play. Well, it wants you to pick out quotes and explain why you think that that is the case. So supporting it with evidence and explaining what it means in terms of the audience understanding. Compare, so showing similarities, sometimes differences between two things. Compare and contrast are two sides of the same coin, let's say. Comparing is kind of more similarities, contrasting is differences. An argument. So if it asks you to argue, it wants, again, you to give your side of a story or an opinion, and it wants you to give reasons to support where you think you are right. And then to what extent? Again, think of the extent as being a scale. For example, let's stick with the question: How does Shakespeare present Macbeth as an ambitious character in the play? So let's think of that as a scale. On one side, you 100% agree he is very ambitious. On the other side, you do not agree he is not ambitious. What it's asking you is, where is Macbeth on that scale of ambition? That's what it wants when it says to what extent. So decide how true something is, and then therefore give evidence or quotes to support that view. So if this was your exam question, what I would do is go through and highlight the important things. And I've done that there, I've done that for you. So Lady Macbeth, firstly, focusing. It wants you to write specifically about Lady Macbeth in this example. Don't go writing about Macbeth, don't write about Banquo, don't write about the witches. It wants specifically Lady Macbeth. Is a female character. There's a reason that the question has given you the word female. It wants you to make a point of linking to gender in your argument, otherwise it wouldn't have said that. And again, the changes during the play, they've specifically used these words, asking you why. How has she been presented as a woman who changes? Does she change? That's up to you to decide, but support it with evidence. It then says, starting with this moment. Again, there's a reason it's given you that. It wants you to focus on the extract given. Explore how far you agree with this view. So, going back, explore in this question is the one that was given. Very similar to analyze. Analyze and explore within the same ballpark. It wants you to decide, based on evidence, to what extent on a scale you agree with this statement. And then finally, like how. I've circled the words how because it wants evidence. It wants you to link the techniques, so our written, our structural techniques, and it wants you to really analyze and pick apart. And then therefore, and as the play as a whole. So starting with the moment it gives you, and therefore the play as a whole. Right. So mind maps are a great way at quickly organizing your thoughts about an essay or a topic. So what I would do if this was the question about ambition, how is ambition presented in the play Macbeth? I put ambition as a central topic, and I start to spiral out from there. Start with characters. So what they've done here is they've talked about all the characters. Then they've linked quotes of what these characters have said. Then they start to analyze the quotes. I wouldn't spend more than 5-10 minutes doing this in an exam. I would recommend doing this more so away from an exam because I think it's a great way to organize your ideas and see all the possible options of things you could talk about. But I'd start to add branches to this. So key points, what things could you talk about? Are there any linking ideas, linking lines to things that connect that you could, again, using that linking sentence too? Quotes and evidence, and then different perspectives. Can you see things in different ways? Are there different interpretations that you could talk about? But don't worry about order yet. In this step, I wouldn't worry about organizing and planning the flow of your essay. The point of a mind map is simply just to get all your ideas in one place, just to get them all out. Step 3 is then organizing the ideas. So this can be a bit daunting, especially when you have quite a huge map like this. But the way that I would start doing this is grouping similar ideas. So like they've done here, use different colors to link things, to keep them within the same theme or the same group of ideas. So sorting ideas into groups, which can often become the points of your paragraphs. Checking for a logical flow. Can you order points so that it makes sense for a reader to follow? So for example, we could order them in chronology of the play. So we could say Act 1 ambition, Act 2, then Act 3, Act 4, Act 5. Or we could do it by character. So I do a paragraph about Macbeth, a paragraph about Lady Macbeth. So does one point naturally lead to the next? And are we actually building an argument or are we just listing ideas? Should a weaker point come first or last is an interesting question. I would start with your most or your strongest point because you want to hook the reader. You want to show that examiner that you know exactly what you're talking about and you've hit the ground running, as it were. And then planning transitions. So using linking phrases between paragraphs. Instead of just saying like another way Shakespeare explores ambition, you could say in contrast, or this leads to, or similarly, or simultaneously. I'd start to think about words that you could use to link paragraphs in more of a creative way because it makes it more engaging, if nothing else, for the reader, and it shows that you can link ideas, which you get marked for in the exam. Okay, so starting to really pick apart an essay then. The introduction is the first section that a reader will encounter in your essay. And we begin an introduction with what we call the hook. As I said before, the hook is so important because in today's day and age, nobody concentrates. You know, we're all on our phones, we're all stuck to social media. It really takes something special to get somebody hooked. So if you're writing an essay, you really want to grab somebody's attention. And so the first sentence of your introductory paragraph should do this. It should pique the reader's interest and curiosity. It could be an interesting question. It could be a fact. It could be a statement. But whatever it is, it must set the tone of your essay. So here are some ideas that you could use for the hook. Firstly, a bold statement, something that makes the reader think. So for example, social media is the most dangerous invention of the 21st century. Notice here the key term is most. That's a bold thing to say about evidence. You know, naturally people are going to think, really? And people who disagree with that is really going to hook them. So Can we pick superlatives like that, like the most or the best, the least? All these kind of words that don't really give room for argument and therefore hook us in. It could be a question, rhetorical, based at the reader, perhaps. So, what would you do if your entire future depended on one decision? A rhetorical question like that is lovely because it engages the reader to really think back in their own mind and put themselves in the situation or the topic of this essay. So, I mean, I think for my when I was applying to university, I used quite a few rhetorical questions within my personal statement, and they really are effective. So, I would recommend. You could use a surprising fact or a statistic. So, for example, the average teenager spends over 7 hours a day on screens. You read something like that, and it really just makes you consider, like, is that true? And therefore you're drawn in. So you could use the shock or the wow factor to draw a reader in and really engage somebody into wanting to read on. A quotation of someone famous. It could be inspirational. It could be something that just makes you think. Could be something outrageous. So, for example, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. If you are to use a quotation, I would make sure it's relevant to your topic. So, for example, here they talked about equality. So you could use this kind of quote if you were talking about animal rights, for example, or even just rights in general, because it has a theme linking to your essay. So I wouldn't use a quote if it was not directly linking to what you're talking about. Oh, finally, you could use a short story or scenario. You could use an anecdote, something that happened to you that was shocking and would engage people. So, for example, imagine waking up one day to find your freedom had quietly disappeared. It gets the reader thinking. Again, it puts them into that scenario, thinking, oh, what if that happened to me? And then they want to read on. So, all of these are psychological tactics to make someone want to read. And again, that's more important than ever. So, next, once you've hooked them in, you want to give the reader some context or background about what you're actually going to be talking about. So, context is this information that your reader needs to know to understand the topic before you're going to give them all of the argument. This is important because nobody wants to read an essay that they're not going to understand. Nobody wants to be talked down to and made to feel like they're stupid. So the context plays a vital part in the introduction because it gives the reader a sense of sort of autonomy. It makes them feel like they understand a high level topic, which is good because it plays on our human need or desire to fit in with others. So it's a good, again, psychological technique to make people read on. So it involves setting the scene. And you should give just enough background so that the reader knows what you're talking about, but not too much because you don't want to spoil your entire essay. So it should only really be one or two sentences, just something, again, to hook them in, make them feel important, but without completely giving away what you're going to talk about. Because then people aren't going to read on. They're just going to go, oh, well, now I know how this essay ends. I don't need to read on. And you could include, for example, a brief summary of the topic, whether that's some historical or social context, something that gives them understanding. You could have a short introduction to the text. If it's a novel, for example, you might want to link to something the author has written about their own book or their own work, linking it to other people's essays, for example. And then you could include key terms. So again, if there's some fancy terms that you're not sure if the reader's going to understand, I know this is quite applicable to scientific work. In science, when we're writing about research, we often use or explain key terms within the introduction because again, you don't want your reader to feel stupid. You want them to feel like they understand. And so you need to give them keywords if it's going to be complicated because you want them to understand. You want them to be able to engage properly. But if they don't understand the key words when they're reading, they're just going to think, well, I don't get this, and they're going to tune out and switch off. And so, again, psychological tactic. You need to be able to help them understand because it's your job as a writer to guide the reader, especially if you want to convince them of something. Essay question then could be an example of how does Shakespeare present ambition in Macbeth? This big overarching question. And a bit of context as an example, you could say something like written in the early 1600s, Shakespeare's Macbeth explores ambition, how ambition can lead to power and ultimately to destruction. That is enough context to hook the reader. Because I'm reading that and I would go, oh, power and destruction. They're two themes that really like grab me in. So you could, that'd be enough context. And then finally, the last part of the introduction, and this is what people have been asking me about, so I'm even going into a little bit more detail on this one, is the thesis statement. So a thesis statement, for those of you who've never heard of one, is basically your entire essay if it was condensed into one or two sentences. So if your essay, or it should be rather, a concise summary of what you're going to talk about. So your main points, and I guess your opinion on the subject. And it should come at the end of an introduction or near enough to the end. Because its job is to outline the central argument, provide the focus of your essay. Again, you're the guide. You're here to weave a narrative. You're here to guide and hold the reader's hand. And that's exactly what the thesis statement does. So there's certain elements that a thesis statement should contain. One of them being clarity and focus. You need to make sure that you're clearly stating what you're going to talk about or what the subject of the essay is, because you don't want people to tune out. It helps you to stay on topic that way. It should be a roadmap for the essay. It should preview the structure and the key points, helping to organize supporting arguments effectively. It should pretty effectively define the scope and direction of the argument. So this is what I was kind of hinting at, is you want to give the reader your opinion without fully giving them your opinion. You want to kind of state, this is kind of what I think, but I'm not going to tell you all my reasons why just yet. And that's what a thesis statement should do. And it's there for engagement. It sparks the reader's interest by presenting a clear stance, and therefore encouraging the reader to think critically about the topic, which is important if it's, well, I guess an ethical thing, for example. You want them to think, and you want them to be engaged. So, carrying on, thesis statement characteristics. Clarity and precision, as I just mentioned, you want to clearly convey the main idea. And to do this, you want to use unambiguous language. You don't want to confuse the reader. You want to make sure that they fully understand the argument. You want to make an arguable claim, something that presents a perspective or opinion that can be debated. So it's not just a fact. You want the reader to be able to think for themselves. You want to invite a discussion, have this critical analysis that encourages a deeper exploration. Because at the end of the day, you want the reader to be motivated to think for themselves. You want them to see your side. Being specific, focusing on a very particular aspect of the topic. Don't go off topic, because then the reader loses interest. Scope and focus. You want it to be a balanced argument, broad enough to explore, but narrow enough to manage. So this is what I was saying about you don't want to give your entire argument away, otherwise people tune out. So it needs to be something that grabs their attention enough to make them think, but not something that's going to completely spoil your argument, because then they just won't read the rest. And it needs to be something that's insightful, so offering a thoughtful or original perspective that adds depth to the topic and underlines the significance of the topic in context. So kind of linking on to this, here are some tips. So be specific, avoid vague language, clearly outline your main arguments on your key points. I would take a picture of this, by the way. It's good tips for how to write a thesis statement. Always making sure to take a clear stance. So stand behind your opinion. Don't just say something and then go, oh, maybe I'm wrong. Stand behind it. If you believe in it, follow through. Because if you have confidence in something, the reader will feel confident in that argument as well. Whereas if you approach an argument going, oh, well, I kind of think this because there's evidence on it. However, someone else proposed this idea, so maybe it's not true. They're not going to believe in you. They're not going to be convinced by you. So if you're trying to persuade, confidence, stand behind what you believe. Be determined in the way that you talk about it, but also keep it concise. So sticking to 1 to 2 sentences. And that kind of comes hand in hand. You wouldn't think it does, but something that's concise and short packs a punch. It's powerful. You need to, confidence is key. You want to give off an air on a vibe that what you're saying is correct. You don't need to give all this evidence to support what you're saying in the thesis statement. You're just saying it how it is, and the reader should therefore believe you. So if you give your idea or your opinion with confidence, it will allow people to have confidence in that idea as well. But it should also encourage critical thinking. So stay aligned, make sure it is relevant. Okay, so a bit of a more deep dive then. Step one to writing a thesis statement is the topic sentence. And this is based on the essay question. So breaking it down into the subject, the broader area. So for example, are we talking specifically about climate change? Are we talking about Shakespeare? Are we talking about World War I? Be specific about the subject of your essay. Always making sure to focus on what the question wants you to do. So go back to those words. Is it asking you to compare? Is it asking you to explain, to argue, to analyze? To what extent do you agree? But making sure to link to whatever the question has asked. So for example, the question might be, what are the key differences between wind and solar energy? Your thesis statement might be, while both are renewable, solar energy is more consistent in sunny climates, whilst wind is more reliable in coastal areas. Factual information. You've linked it directly to the question. You've used no ambiguous terms, and you've given both sides of the story. Okay. And once you've got the topic, think about the purpose. Why are you writing this essay? Because that should affect your thesis statement. So for example, we looked at the different types of an essay. So for example, an expository essay is just the facts. So for example, what are the main effects of social media on teenagers? So you might say, if you're just looking at the facts, no opinions, no debate, social media affects teenagers by influencing their communication skills, self-image, and sleeping habits. You've got quite a confident tone in this thesis statement. You're saying what you believe and you're following through with it. No debate, no critical analysis. You've answered the purpose of the question whilst linking to the topic. If it's analytical, it might be asking you why. So why has something done this? Why has the writer written this in a certain way? Or it could be in this example, why does social media affect teenagers' mental health? It wants you to break it down, look for evidence. So you might say, well, social media impacts teenage mental health by increasing compassion, disrupting sleep, and lowering self-esteem. There's evidence to what you're saying there. And you'd link later in your essay citations to prove that. But can you see the difference here? Expository is purely looking for facts. Analytical is breaking it down. And these determine how you can structure your thesis statement. Now, if something is argumentative, it wants you to take a side, to make an opinion. So it could be, should social media use be limited for teenagers? You know from this question, from the tone of this question, there's going to look for some sort of debate. So in your thesis statement, you might say, social media use should be limited for teens due to its negative effects on mental health, academic focus, and real-life relationships. In this type of statement, you've given your argument. You said it should be limited. You've given it in a confident way. You've not dilly-dallied. You've not gone, oh, but maybe this, maybe that. You said, no, it should. And here's my reasons why. You've delivered it in a confident tone. You've answered the question, linking it to the type of question that it is. And you've given it purpose. And if something is discursive, so that's presenting both sides, pros and cons, the question could be, does social media do more harm than good for teenagers? Well, you could say, while social media offers benefits like easier communication and self-expression, its negative impact on mental health and focus, it may do more harm than good. So again, you can see the difference here. Argumentative, we've given our side, we've given our opinion, we said it should be limited. Whereas in discursive, we've given both sides. We said, oh, well, it does have benefits, but also I can see the other side of the argument, and we're going to explore that in this essay. So I hope you're seeing how your introduction, your thesis statement, and how you grab people in really does depend on what you're being asked in the question. And then finally, the length of your entire essay. So if it's a shorter essay, you want simple, clear thoughts, something around 500 to 800 words. So for example, PhysiJunk, so this would affect, sorry, your thesis statement. If you're only writing a really short essay, you only really want a short thesis statement. So fizzy drinks should be banned in schools because they harm student health. Something short, something snappy. However, if it's a longer essay and you're writing something over 1,000 words, you might want a longer thesis statement. So banning fizzy drinks in schools would improve student health, reduce sugar addiction, and encourage better habits. You've added on to this by using some evidence or some sort of argument. Whereas if it's a shorter essay, you might just want to get straight to the point. So this is an example of a good introduction. And then we'll quickly move on to the rest of the essay. So in this introduction, the person has said, the invention of Braille marked a major turning point in the history of disability. The writing system of raised dots used by the blind and visually impaired was developed by Louis Braille in 19th century France, in a society that did not value disabled people in general. Blindness was particularly stigmatized, and a lack of access to reading and writing was a significant barrier to social participation. The idea of tactile reading was not entirely new, but existing methods based on sighted systems were difficult to learn and use. So already in blue, I've highlighted the hook. They've used a bold claim. So they've said the invention of Braille marked a major turning point. That's a bold thing to say. And as a reader, you're hooked in, you're thinking, okay, why is it a bold thing? Because that's quite a statement to make without evidence. They then followed it on with a little bit of context, a little bit of background to the topic. So they've given who invented Braille. They talked about why it was important at the time, because blind people were stigmatized. They talked about why it mattered, what were the social challenges. And then they followed it by a thesis statement, which says, as the first writing system designed for blind people's needs, Braille was a groundbreaking new accessibility tool. It not only provided practical benefits, but also helped change the cultural status of blindness. So what this thesis statement does is it clearly gives the main argument, which is that Braille was revolutionary. And it begins to explain what made it unique and why it is important, because it sets up both the practical and cultural significance. And then you could end your introduction with a structural overview, basically saying what you're going to talk about in the essay, giving them a sort of roadmap of step by step what things you might bring up, just kind of giving the reader a flow of the argument. So they've said this essay begins by discussing the situation of blind people in 19th century Europe. It then describes the invention of Braille and the gradual process of its acceptance within blind education. Subsequently, it explores the wide range of effects of this invention on blind people and both social and cultural lives. Okay, right, let's quickly move on. After you've written your solid introduction and you've hooked the reader and given context, the main body is going to make up 80% of your entire essay. And the way that we structure the main body is within separate paragraphs. And we've looked quite a lot at how to write paragraphs over the last few weeks, starting with the central topic, adding evidence, and then explaining. So a good way that we've looked at this is point, evidence, explain, context, and we've not really looked at link so far. We've looked in English language, we've looked at Peter. In literature, we've looked at P-Tech. But this is a more generalized view. Point, evidence, explain, context, link. So your point, what is the writer or what is the point you're trying to get across to somebody? What do you want them to, what do you want something to show? What do you want someone to take away from what you're saying? What's the evidence to back up what you're saying? Have you used quotes? Have you used actual data to support what you're saying? So if this was a scientific essay, your evidence might be scientific research data as evidence. If this was a English literature essay, your evidence might be quotes from characters or from narrators. But then it's important to explain, because you can't just make a point and quote. You've got to explain. You can't just say like, oh, well, someone says this. Cool. Well, why has the writer used those words? Why has the character chosen to say that? Why is this research data important for what I'm saying? You've got to explain it because that's what really makes people understand. That's what forms an argument. And that's what really brings people to your side. You're not going to convince anybody if you're just making generalized statements and throwaway statements. You've got to really try and pull something in. Think about an argument. Every time, if you've ever had an argument in your life, you don't just give a point. It's a very childish thing to do to just give a point. Think about young kids versus adults in debates. Young kids will often, in arguments, say something like, well, you're stupid, because that's all their brains can comprehend. But as adults, or as young adults like you are, you should be able to give an explanation. If you were arguing with somebody, you wouldn't just make generalized statements. You wouldn't just try and make someone feel bad. You'd be trying to make them understand your way of thinking. And that's the explanation part and why it's important. Then linking it to context. So if this was an English literature essay, for example, Macbeth, how does it link to the Great Chain of Being and why is that important for the audience? If this was a scientific essay, how does it link to the general scientific context of the time? Why is that important? Why is it important we've made all these advancements? What's going on in the world at the minute? If we're thinking about a specific disease, why is it important that we cure it? Why haven't we been able to cure it in the past? So context is important for really emphasizing why your argument is important to make someone believe in or to get across. And then always linking it back to the question. So the last sentence of your paragraph should connect your point back to the essay question. So the good way to do this is to reuse words from the question. So for example, summing up your point in a clear, confident way, one sentence is enough. So for example, this shows that Shakespeare presents ambition as a dangerous force that leads to destruction. Okay. And we'll skip straight to citations. Actually, no, we'll go back. So this is an example of a good main paragraph that somebody wrote. So this is carrying on with the blind argument and why it's important that we've developed cures for blindness, or the use of Braille rather. So they said, and notice they've started with a topic sentence. Lack of access to reading and writing put blind people at a serious disadvantage. They started with a topic sentence. They've clearly stated the main point of the paragraph, which is that blind people faced a major social challenge due to limited literacy access. And it sets the focus for what the paragraph will explain. They've made their point straight away, and they're going to follow it with evidence. So text was one of the primary methods through which people engaged with culture, communicated with others, and accessed information. Without a well-developed reading system that did not rely on sight, blind people were excluded from social participation. While disabled people in general suffered from discrimination, blindness was widely viewed as the worst disability. And it was commonly believed that blind people were incapable of pursuing a profession or improving themselves through culture. So what they've done here is they've used the evidence. They've started to give some explanation by providing factual support, showing why access to reading is crucial. And notice, this is something I want to get you used to seeing, because if you take any sort of science or any sort of English or history beyond GCSE, you're going to start coming across citations like this. So notice what they've done is after they've made a statement or used some evidence, they've done what we've called cited it. So here, for example, they put Weygand 2009. All that is a reference to some material that they've used to support their argument. So if this was scientific data, you might want to link the study that you're using to support your argument. It just gives your study credibility, showing that what you're saying is correct, it does have importance, and you're not just picking arguments out of thin air. And then they've interpreted it at the end, and they've explained what the evidence actually means. And they've linked it to social status and emphasized the wider importance whilst linking it back. So our point evidence, explain, context, and link. We'll skip citations. Right. Finally, then, a conclusion. our argument should end with a paragraph that's only, I would not even argue 10 to 15%, I would argue 5% of our entire essay. And it's all it is, all the conclusion is a final paragraph. It should summarize the essay. You should be able to give the reader a generalized summary of what your opinion is. So what a conclusion should include is a return to the thesis statement, summarizing your main point and explaining why your argument matters. And it should end with something memorable to make sure that the reader remembers you and your argument. However, your conclusion should avoid introducing new ideas. You're at the end of the essay now. There's no point trying to get in that last bit of facts, nothing. What a conclusion should do is tie up very nicely your argument. It should be the final thing that gets the reader to be convinced by your argument. It should not weaken your argument. Like I said before, if you have an opinion, stand by it. Deliver it with confidence. Don't say like, oh, well, this is just one opinion of many. Stand by your opinion. Say, no, I believe in this. The evidence supports this. So the reader should believe in it as well. And don't overuse phrases. So don't say like, oh, in conclusion, or to sum up. Just emphasize or summarize the main points. Give your opinion and stand by it. That's what a good conclusion should do. And this is a good example of a conclusion from the blindness essay. So they say Braille paved the way for dramatic cultural changes in the way blind people were treated and the opportunities available to them. In this first sentence, notice they've given you the major point of what you should have taken away from the essay. It's told you why it is important. Louis Braille's innovation was to reimagine existing reading systems from a blind perspective. And the success of this invention required sighted teachers to adapt to their students' reality instead of the other way around. In this sense, Braille helped drive broader social changes in the status of blindness. So they've given evidence. They've really tried to drill it home, their argument, and really try and hammer home why what they've said is important and you should take it away. New accessibility tools provide practical advantages to those who need them, but they can also change perspectives and attitudes of those who do not. So notice, nowhere in this conclusion have they introduced new ideas. They've simply summarized everything they've said before, really hammered home why it is important in terms of the context, and they've delivered their argument and opinion in a very confident way. They've not said, oh, well, there are other arguments, or in my opinion. They've said, no, this is the facts as it is. They've not even said, like, in my opinion. They've delivered it as if it was fact. And that is what a good conclusion should do. Okay. And then finally, the last things to think about then is once you've written the draft, there's always editing and improving to do. So checking your thesis statements, checking your essay. Does your essay clearly answer the question? So if this was an exam, I'd always leave 5 minutes at the end. Just read back through your essay. Have you actually answered the question directly? Does your paragraphs or do your paragraphs have a good logical flow? Have you used clear evidence and been able to explore and explain this evidence in detail? Is your language and tone consistent? If this is a formal piece of writing that's non-fiction, have you been appropriate to the task at hand? If it's a letter, have you written it as a letter? If it's asking for a speech, is it an engaging speech, or have you gone into too much detail about things? So you need to make sure you've written appropriately to what the question is asking. Have you avoided slang or repeated words? And then fixing spelling and grammar. And again, I cannot stress to you, in creative writing, in your English language paper, spelling, punctuation, and grammar is 16 out of 40 marks. Even in your literature essays, 4 marks, or rather 4 marks on each paper, so 8 marks in total, out of 160 are spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So it's really important because they're easy marks to get. So going through and checking, have you made mistakes, typos, spelling errors? Have you made grammar mistakes? So it's really important to edit and improve. And then very finally, the very final thing to go through then, before we take a 2-minute break, is how to keep your essay engaging. Have you used, and I cannot stress this enough, varied sentence structures? Have you used a mix of short and long sentences? Have you used a range of vocabulary that is vivid, so avoided repeating words? Have you used those rhetorical questions that we talked about? Because that's a good psychological tactic to draw someone in. Have you used interesting quotes that go against the grain, that aren't just what everybody else would have picked? Is your topic focused? Have you stuck to what the question is asking? Have you got a logical flow? And then, most importantly, I would argue actually, is really reiterating this idea of confidence. Has what you've written, does it include passion? Does it show that you actually care about the subject? Have you written confidently rather than just saying like, oh, in my opinion, or like, oh, there are other ways of seeing this? Have you said, no, this is my opinion. These are the facts. This is my evidence. This is why you should believe in it. And the last thing I will leave you with is that idea before we take a break, is whenever you're writing an essay, if you don't believe in what you're writing, the reader will not believe in it either. You have to believe. You have to write with confidence because then that is what is convincing. Right, okay. Let's take 2 minutes and then we're going to move on to our Key Stage 4 GCSE sort of stuff for today. And we're going to start looking again at this idea of Macbeth. So we're going to look specifically at the character of Macbeth in Act 1 of the play. If there's anyone here, welcome to everyone who's joined. If there's anyone from Key Stage 4 or GCSE year 9, 10, 11, who has missed the first hour, who thinks it would be important or useful to go through how to write an essay, what to include in an essay, this will be available online. So I'd recommend going back because I think it is useful. But hello, everyone. Good evening. Hope you're all good. So let's take 2 minutes. Right. Right then. Let's make a start. On the next part, I'm going to try and get through most of this, but I have a feeling we might not get through all of this. So, as our sort of theme of what we have been doing in the past sort of few weeks, I've begun to explore with you Macbeth, and we kind of focused a lot on the witches. And so this week, I really want to start our focus on Macbeth because he is our protagonist. He's our main characters. Um, he's our main character rather. So it's important that we understand. But I want to break him down between acts because it is very likely that you could get a question about him in the exam. And I know this year's question was specifically about him. He comes up very specifically every few years. But he changes. The main thing about this character is that he changes. And so I thought it was probably important to maybe break him down act by act. So those of you who haven't read Macbeth yet, or those of you who are reading Macbeth, it's split into 5 acts. And we split plays into acts based on what happens in the story. So this is Act 1 of 5. Just a brief reminder of how to structure or what is expected of you in this exam is that the Macbeth question will be 30 marks. And for those of you that have come every week will know this by now, but I'm just hoping I can drill it into you. You get 4 marks extra for spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And I'm not going to go over this because I've been through this every week now, and we don't really have time, but AO1, making points, you're expected to write about language and structure, and you're expected to include context. So just as a really brief reminder, AO2 is about language and structure. Like I was just saying in the last session, you can't just give a point and give evidence and not explain it. AO2 is that explanation. It's about more than just saying like this is what I believe in. You have to give evidence and explanation. So in AO2, you're expected to look at language and structure. So language is the specific word choices. What do they show about the character? You know, is there a metaphor? Is there a simile? Is there allusion? Why has Shakespeare used those? What does it tell you about the character? And then structure is how the scene and play is presented. Does anything change throughout? And there's a reason I've highlighted this structure because I'm purposefully splitting this between the acts because if we know anything about Macbeth, he is a character who changes very much so and very evidently so. And so it's easier to think about him in terms of act by act. So basic plot summary then, just remind ourselves of what actually happens in the play. So Macbeth is a tragedy, and we've looked at a tragedy. If you weren't here for the past few sessions, go back, remind yourselves what constitutes a tragic play. It's about a brave Scottish general named Macbeth. After winning a battle, he meets 3 witches who prophesize that he will become the king of Scotland. They encourage him, through the prophecies, and the ambition of his wife, Lady Macbeth, to murder the current King Duncan. However, Macbeth becomes paranoid and starts killing everyone he sees as a threat, including his best friend Banquo and Macduff's family. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth is consumed by guilt and goes mad. Macbeth's rule becomes increasingly violent and unstable, and in the end, Macduff leads an army against Macbeth. He kills Macbeth, and Malcolm, Duncan's son, becomes king. So, firstly, we're going to break this down by scene. There's only a few scenes that Macbeth is actually in. But before we go into Act 1, Scene 2, here's a few questions I want you to start thinking about as we go through. What do we learn about Macbeth before we meet him? How do other people's praise of Macbeth shape your first impressions? How is Macbeth's ambition and fate as a tragic hero presented early on in the play? And how is the theme of violence used early in the play? And there's a little bit of structure, a little bit of context about Act 1, Scene 2. This specific scene comes straight after the witches. So we open the play, Act 1, Scene 1. The witches are on the heath. They're giving the audience introduced to their tyranny immediately. Then, Act 1, Scene 2, it follows where the play opens with a bloody battlefield where Macbeth, the Thane of Glamis, is lauded for his bravery and skill, meaning he's celebrated for his bravery in battle. He is instrumental in defeating the rebel MacDonald and the Norwegian forces. King Duncan is impressed by Macbeth's valor and decides to reward him by bestowing him the title of the Thane of Cawdor, unaware that the current Thane of Cawdor has betrayed him. He sends messengers to tell Macbeth, and this act of treason sets the stage for Macbeth's own moral descent. Now, it's really important, and I've highlighted this to you on the bottom, that this is the first time that we as an audience hear about Macbeth. but he is not in this scene. He does not appear, he does not speak, but we learn so much about him. So I want you to start thinking about why Shakespeare has made that structural choice. Why do we get introduced to him without actually seeing him? And it's worth saying, structure-wise, AO2, this is within the exposition of the play. And if you've been to my past few sessions, we looked at structure. The exposition is the beginning. It's the part of the play or the story where we learn things about characters. The conflict starts to be set up. So, structure-wise, this scene is important because it establishes Macbeth's initial character. It presents many examples of foreshadowing. So if you ever want to talk about foreshadowing in an essay, Act 1, Scene 2 is an immaculate one to do so. Because it establishes Macbeth's ambition and violence, albeit in Control and Tame, but it is there. So if you get a question in your exam, violence has yet to come up as a question. This scene is a beautiful one to talk about structure of violence because this scene sets up the importance of violence in the play because it presents violence as something good when it shouldn't. So violence is applauded within this scene. It's looked favorably on by the king. And it's Macbeth's violence and courage that actually gets him rewarded. And that's very ironic considering that later down the line, he commits several acts of murder, which uses his violence in a negative way. So before we even meet him, Macbeth is, and I've highlighted this, defined by his violence. And this is so important to remember. We haven't even met him yet. What we do know about him is that he is a very violent man. And this suggests that even when noble, violence is a dangerous foundation for identity. So, some key quotes, as always, to remember for Act 1, Scene 2. You can take these away, screenshot, do whatever you want with them, but these are some good ones that will help you in exams. So, as always, let's start to pick apart the AO2 and AO3 of these quotes. So the first one, "O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman, what he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won." This is said by the king, by King Duncan, and it's important. So let's start with the "O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman." Duncan uses what we call explanatory epithets. So these are calling somebody something. So cousin, worthy gentleman, he's calling them, he's naming them something. He's given them titles. That's what an epithet is. And he's done so, if you notice, in quite an exclamatory way. A valiant cousin, exclamation mark, worthy gentleman, exclamation mark. So Macbeth is presented as a national hero with great reputability very immediately, at the very beginning of the play. And the short exclamatory sentences emphasize Duncan's enthusiasm. They show that he very much likes Macbeth and therefore presents his violence as quite a positive thing. Starting to pick apart the key words, we get this semantic field. The valiant, worthy, noble. The adjectives reflect how Macbeth is viewed as a public model of loyalty. They are within the semantic field of chivalry and honor. And this establishes Macbeth as a tragic hero, someone who begins high in status and esteem. So if you think back to our context, we looked at what it means to be a tragic hero. So it's somebody who starts well-liked and then goes through a downfall and becomes somebody who's hated or somebody who does something evil. So structurally, we could talk about him being, this is the first example of his contextual tragic hero nature being set up. We also get this sort of like juxtaposing nature here. What he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won. This sets up many of the themes and contextual points of the play. The old Thane has actually betrayed Duncan, and so he's lost his position. Yet Macbeth honors Duncan, so wins the position. This presents Macbeth as loyal, ambitious, and respectable compared to the old Thane, as the mirrored structure creates what we call a chiasmus, this sort of like reflecting structure. So if I was to put a mirror down the middle of this sentence, I'd have some sort of symmetry. So what he hath lost, Macbeth hath won. Are the opposites there. And this is important structurally because it provides an emphasis as to sort of the moral contrast between the two men. We know that The person who portrayed Duncan has lost. He's done something negative. He's gone against the king, which we know contextually is such a terrible thing because the king represented God. So going against the king wasn't just a legal crime, it was also a spiritual and moral one as well. Whereas it's contrasting Macbeth to that negative action and saying Macbeth hath won. It's presenting him as noble and loyal. And then we also get this sort of dramatic irony, this foreshadowing. Because if you remember back to what we did in The Witches last week, if you look back at Act 1, Scene 3, The Witches actually used this exact line, or rather a very similar line about Macbeth losing and winning. And so this kind of mirrors the language of The Witches, therefore establishing Macbeth's ambition before we even meet him, foreshadowing his human flaw of hubris. Duncan's blindness to Macbeth's inner ambition makes him naive and heightens the tension because the fact that Duncan says this is structurally important because it foreshadows Macbeth's moral corruption. So, can we link this in any way to context and what we went over in terms of what's happening at the time? Well, these exclamatory epithets kind of we can link to gender. At the time, masculinity was deeply tied to honor and physical violence. So men were expected to be brave and fierce and noble. And so Duncan's praise kind of celebrates Macbeth as a male idol of heroism. But this has very weak foundations because obviously we know nowadays violence is a very negative thing. But back then it was believed to show you that you were loyal, that you were loyal to the king and that you respected the king. So Shakespeare actually basically creates a problem out of this. The very qualities that win Macbeth honor, so his violence in war, are actually what leads to him losing his place, being corrupted and destroying him. So this kind of gives us a sort of irony in the context of gender, that violence is seen as something rewardable, but actually that's what leads to Macbeth's downfall. The idea of the semantic field we can link to this tragic hero context. It's setting him up as someone who's high and worthy, who could undergo a fall from grace. This sort of like mirrored chiasmus structure we can link to the great chain and the divine right of kings, because Duncan is God's representative on earth. God has theoretically chosen Duncan to rule. And so by him rewarding Macbeth, it's giving Macbeth status. Except it foreshadows what's going to happen later, that Macbeth actually breaks the great chain by killing Duncan. And so it adds a layer of irony to the situation. And then finally, we can think about this idea of fate versus free will. This link to the witches, kind of what we were talking about last week, is this idea of to what extent is Macbeth actually responsible for what he's done? Was it always meant to be in fate? Or does he have his own free will and choice to do what he did? So the lost and won sounds inevitable, like a predetermined transfer of fortune linking to the witches, but it hints at a larger possible supernatural pattern. However, the audience knows that Macbeth is making his own conscious choices. So again, it's that question. Okay. This one was said again by sort of Duncan. So he later says, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, carved out of his passage, Bellona's bridegroom. So disdaining fortune, we can talk about in terms of personification. It's almost as if fortune is the thing that's given human qualities, almost presented as if it's a force that Macbeth seems to actively reject. Because here it's talking about Macbeth. He's saying Macbeth disdains fortune. So this implies that he defies chance or fate, therefore presenting him as a man of autonomy. He has his own free will, his own choice to commit his own actions. Someone who controls his own destiny through action, not luck. And this hints also at his hubris as a tragic hero. So the word disdaining is a powerful choice here, because it suggests that not only that Macbeth resists fate, but he's superior to it as well. So reinforcing his early signs of ambition and arrogance. Okay, thinking then about disdaining fortune with a brandished steel, Bellona's bridegroom. So the brandished steel, Bellona's bridegroom. Not only do we have alliteration twice, but we have multiple B's. And there's a reason for this. If you think back to our Lexis, B's are plosive, they're hard-hitting sounds. And this is important because it links to this idea of violence. The B sound mimics that violent feel. So by having that double plosive B sound, it's presenting Macbeth as aggressive, fearless, and powerful. The focus on his weapon here elevates him to a role of the masculine warrior hero, embodying ideals of honor through violent strength. Think about this idea of the sword as well. The brandished steel is mentioning his sword. It's what it refers to. So the sword becomes an extension of his identity. We're not talking about Macbeth directly, we're linking him to his sword. And the plosive Lexis intensifies the sense of dominance and aggression to reinforce the image of Macbeth as a conqueror, as it mimics the sound of violence and injury inflicted by that weaponry. So that double plosive sound and the choice of linking him to the brandished steel, the sword, was a conscious choice by Shakespeare because it's really emphasizing this idea of violence early on in the play. Okay, so let's look at Bellona's bridegroom. This is an example of illusion. So if you think about illusion, that's when we sort of like link something to what the audience already understands. So at the time, the audience would have known who Bellona is. Not so common nowadays, but the audience would therefore have associations about Bellona and that character Bellona, which they could then link to Macbeth. So Bellona was a Roman goddess of war. Tells you all that you need to know. Macbeth is being linked not only to war again, to violence, but to a god. So giving him this divine power, elevating him to almost a supernatural warrior status. The metaphor, calling him bridegroom, implies that Macbeth is married to war, highlighting how his identity is completely tied to violence and battle. Much like when people get married, they're linked to their spouse. By referring to him as a bridegroom, it's linking him to his sword, to his violence. He's becoming indistinguishable from violence, which is important in this theme of violence setting up in the play. Something that becomes tragically literal as his moral corruption grows. It's also the semantic field of heroism. Okay, and then finally, the carved out of his passage, this metaphor and imagery, where Macbeth's violence is linked to an artistic way of thinking. The idea of the carving. When somebody carves something, you can almost think of like a sculptor sort of like chiseling away at stone. It's kind of presenting in a strange way violence as this kind of like artistic expression. Which suggests like ruthless precision more than anything else. Okay. So again, linking it to context. Very similar context to what we've been through in the previous quote. So firstly, disdaining fortune. This idea of fate versus free will again. Fortune, Macbeth is actively rejecting this idea of fortune. So emphasizing that message of, is Macbeth fully to blame for his own actions, or is it all predetermined fate? So Macbeth's rejection of fate aligns him with the witches' later prophecies as they manipulate his perception of fate. Ironically, his desire to control destiny leads him down the path the witches intended all along, raising the question, is he truly exercising free will, or is he merely fulfilling a fate already written to him? Okay, this brandished steel, this plosive double alliteration of these then, almost sets him up as a tragic hero again. He's presented as a valiant man of nobility, someone who's high up in status. Our tragic hero should begin high up and then he should fall from grace. So being Bellona's bridegroom mythologizes him, puts him up as a god almost, elevates him to a divine level. This makes his eventual downfall more profound. However, it also highlights the hamartia of his hubris, as if left unchecked, these same traits could lead him into tyranny. Now, Bellona's bridegroom. We can link this sort of to the witches context, the idea that King James at the time really hated witches. They were sort of seen as a demonic force. So the reference to Bellona, who is actually a pagan goddess, she's not a Christian goddess, and Christianity kind of ruled England at the time. So the link to a pagan goddess subtly ties into the play's broader concern with the supernatural forces and anti-Christian symbolism. Macbeth's association with this pagan mythology might have actually disturbed a Christian audience, because King James's demonology book believed strongly that the witches were servants of the devil. So Macbeth's ability to go against fate and be presented as this anti-Christian god almost presents him as having this dark force, which therefore foreshadows his misuse of violence later down the line. And then the great chain of being, the carving of his passage, this idea of the carving, he's in charge of his own fate, therefore almost presenting him as going against the great chain, foreshadowing impending chaos to come. Okay, so what actually is the purpose of Act 1, Scene 2? Because we've just seen Macbeth is presented or talked about without actually ever being present there. But why? Well, Macbeth is established as a tragic hero, first and foremost. His noble nature provides a stronger contrast towards tyranny. And this creates a journey for our protagonist. It allows the audience to follow him through his downfall and try to understand what caused it. However, we never actually, and this is important to remember, we never actually see Macbeth's nature before the war. The first thing that we as an audience know about Macbeth is that he is linked to war. So linking this idea of violence straight off the bat. We never see him before war. So we don't know whether he was a good character or whether he already had violence and tyranny in his nature. So this mystery remains as to whether Macbeth was already somewhat tyrannous, and we will never know. But that's done on purpose, because that's supposed to make you as an audience member think. Duncan is established as a kind and honourable king. His praise of Macbeth makes Macbeth's later actions more shocking and unnatural, as the audience respect and love the king. And this emphasizes the severity of Macbeth's later regicide, the killing of Duncan, making it more painful. This scene sets up Macbeth's fatal flaw, theme of free will and fate. Macbeth's inner demons are hinted at but never explicitly stated, and this makes the audience curious as to Macbeth's character. This scene establishes the theme of order, so that Macbeth's later actions seem exaggerated and prominent, and then finally establishes the theme of violence, which underscores both this scene and the rest of the play, because this scene, or this play, is a part of the mystery of Macbeth's character. Was he already tyrannous, or was he led this way by fate? So, that is Act 1, Scene 2. We never see Macbeth. We only get presented things about him linking to war. And so already you should be thinking about how you'd have answered those questions that I got you to think about before. How is Macbeth presented before we even meet him? As a character of war, as a violent and potentially tyrannous man. And it foreshadows quite a lot. It's a good one to use in exams. Okay, the next time we see, well, the first time we see Macbeth properly on stage is Act 1, Scene 3. So, more questions to have a think about as we go through. How does Macbeth respond to the witches compared to Banquo? What are your first impressions of Macbeth now that we've seen him properly? How is ambition presented? And how does this scene contribute to the debate of who is to blame for Macbeth's downfall? So, a quick summary of what actually happens in this scene. Well, on a desolate heath, Macbeth and Banquo encounter three witches, who prophesies that Macbeth will become the Thane of Cawdor and eventually the king, while Macbeth's descendants will inherit the throne. Ross and Angus arrive to inform Macbeth that he has been granted the title of the Thane of Cawdor. confirming part of the witch's prophecy and igniting his ambition. So this is a very important scene. Because not only is this the first time that we see Macbeth, and therefore we can make our own judgments about him, but his fatal flaw is already being presented to us before we even get a chance to see his good side. We're being presented with ambition. So ambition is introduced to us as a theme here. So, whilst Act 1 Scene 2 was our exposition, this is our inciting incident. This is the thing that sets Macbeth off into a trail of tyranny. And it's that debate. Was it the witch's fault? Was it prophecy? Or was he already tyrannous? And it's all psychological in his head. So, structurally, why is the scene important? Well, it's the first time that the audience meet Macbeth. The witches play a vital structural role in providing the inciting incident that spurs Macbeth's ambition. However, are the witches to blame? Or did Macbeth already have ambition within him? The witches prophesize Macbeth's future titles, but they also say that Macbeth's sons will be kings. And that is what worries Macbeth, because they never tell him that he will be king. Well, they say he'll be king, but his line won't continue the throne. So there's a shift here from an external to internal conflict as Macbeth begins to be overridden by internal thoughts of ambition. So again, some key quotes. Do with these as you will. I would recommend that you take them for later use as good revision. Give you a few seconds if you want to take them. Okay. So we'll start with this. So foul and fair a day I have not seen, is said by Macbeth. Thinking about what you know about the witches, does this strike you as strange in any way? Because it should. This phrase mirrors what the witches have already said previously. And this is important structurally in terms of his character. Shakespeare has made this choice consciously and has done this on purpose. So when we looked at the witches, we looked at the oxymoronic and fricative nature of this line anyway. Foul and fair, two things that cannot be in the same sentence. You can't be foul and fair, and you can't be fair and foul. They're two contrasting things. And the fricative language comes from the Fs, so this sort of harsh F sounds. That mimics or mirrors directly the witch's earlier dialogue. Why has this been done? Because it's a conscious choice that Shakespeare's made on purpose. This sort of harsh tone creates an unsettling and eerie atmosphere straight off the bat, considering we've just met Macbeth, to highlight the underlying threat and moral conflict. This suggests that Macbeth is already under their influence, or that his fate is tied to theirs. He is linked to the supernatural forces early in the play, and it foreshadows moral conflict as his future will be full of deception, betrayal, and moral reversal, and it therefore also reflects his inner conflict. So this is an important quote because it ties him to the witches quite early on in the play, therefore foreshadowing his tyranny later down the line. And then contextually, we can link it to what was going on at the time. So more importantly, the Great Chain of Being. We've looked at this over the past few weeks, but the Great Chain of Being is this idea that God has put out a hierarchy on earth. And if you were to try and transcend your place within the hierarchy, it leads to chaos in the world around you. And we do see this later in the play. So we can link this to the Great Chain of Being. This idea of two things that cannot be in the same sentence goes against the natural order. So the fricative language suggests something is out of order, hinting that there may already be a disturbance in moral order, which is important structurally for the play. Because it brings back up this question of, is fate in charge of Macbeth's downfall, or was it his own conscious choice? So this foreshadows Macbeth's eventual breaking of the chain when he murders King Duncan, a divinely appointed ruler who would have been higher than him in the hierarchy. So this oxymoron reflects the early cracks in the moral universe caused by ambition by Macbeth wanting to be king. As a tragic hero, Macbeth is meant to begin as noble but flawed. And this line perfectly reflects that. We saw in the previous scene, people praised him for his violence and his nobility and his loyalty. Except here, we've got very much a contrast to that. We're seeing his flaws, his ambition, his hamartia, and it echoes the witch's own language, therefore showing that he is susceptible to evil, not just a victim of it. His hamartia of ambition will soon drive him to destroy the natural order himself. So, looking at how he responds to the witches. We looked at the witches last week. They give the prophecies, telling him that he will be the Thane of Cawdor and the king. His response to the witches is, "Stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more." And this quote perfectly shows him as a character. Just looking at the imperative verbs alone, he tries to command them. He says, "Stay, tell." He's giving this sense of urgency and desperation. So he's clearly very invested in what they have to say. And that reveals Macbeth's fascination, his ambition quite early on. He's not just saying, "Well, I don't believe them." He's wanting to hear more. So already we know something about his psychology. So it shows his overwhelming fascination with their prophecy, suggesting a lack of control and a beginning to his obsession over ambition. And structurally, this occurs quite early in the play, suggesting that he was already plagued with moral insecurity. And his ambition is revealed to establish his hamartia. Macbeth acknowledges that the witches are mysterious and ambiguous by using that adjective of imperfect, but showing that he doesn't just blindly follow them. But it does again show that he is susceptible to evil, because it links them to deception. This idea of imperfection goes against the moral order, shows that they're not meant to be on this earth. And so the fact that he believes them is already strange enough. It already shows that he is not morally correct. And it reflects the theme of appearance versus reality, as the words are only half-truths, which are tempting and dangerous, therefore foreshadowing Macbeth's downfall. Now, contextually, this links again to this idea of fate versus free will. I hope you're beginning to see the pattern here. Early on in the play, we need to come up with our own opinion of whether you think it is fate or free will that is in charge of Macbeth's downfall. But this links to the theme, because even though the witches never tell him to act, they never tell him to kill Duncan, he immediately tries to control or take control of fate by demanding more information. This moment shows Macbeth is wrestling with fate. The witches plant the idea that he will be king, but Macbeth is the one who chooses to act. He's the one that wants to solidify his place. So his free will kicks in as he begins to imagine killing Duncan. And again, I want to repeat from last week and the weeks before, the witches never ever tell him to kill Duncan. It is all Macbeth's choice to do so. So Shakespeare presents the idea that fate tempts, but free will destroys. Macbeth is not forced. He chooses to kill Duncan, which is key to his role as a tragic hero, his downfall. And again, we can link it to the Holinshed Chronicles. So the Holinshed Chronicles were the original source material for Macbeth. In the original version, Macbeth is less guilty and more cautious. But Shakespeare changes this in his version, making Macbeth ambitious and morally conflicted from the very beginning of the play. Shakespeare condenses Macbeth's rise and fall to explore the corrupting power of ambition, and this makes his downfall more pitiful. Its audiences watch a once noble man choose evil out of ambition and an obsession with fate. Now, I wanted to highlight to you the difference between Macbeth's response and Banquo's response. We just saw Macbeth. We saw Macbeth. "Stay, you imperfect speakers." He wants to hear more. He's giving in to his ambition already. But not Banquo. Banquo says, "The earth hath bubbles. Hath we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner?" He calls the witches instruments of darkness, and he says, "Tell us truths." we can already see Banquo is responding with much more skepticism than Macbeth and readily acknowledges the danger of their prophecies. Whereas Macbeth has taken them in. Macbeth has taken them as facts, and it's instilled his ambition to kill Duncan. But Banquo does not cave in so easily. And that, I should say, that is important in Macbeth's character. By placing this contrast is structurally and contextually important as well. Because if you think back to the original Holinshed Chronicles, one of the differences is that in the original source material, Macbeth and Banquo are both evil. They're both part of killing Duncan. Except Shakespeare changes this and makes Banquo a kind character who is there purposefully to contrast to Macbeth. And this is important because it presents the idea that Macbeth is a tyrannous character. It really emphasizes this idea of fate versus free will. Was, again, fate in charge of Macbeth's downfall, or was it his own ambition and his own psychological choices? And having Banquo there almost as like his foil emphasizes that moral debate. So just to clear things up, what Banquo is saying here, when he talks about the insane route, he's basically saying, are we hallucinating? Have we taken some sort of drugs and we're seeing these witches? Is this even real? Is what he's saying. This idea of the prisoner, he's almost linking the witches and the prophecies as like a moral warning. He's basically telling Macbeth, don't listen to them straight away because they'll take over your mind, which we know that they did. And the instrument of darkness, this idea of darkness, again, linking to the idea that the contextual idea of thinking that witches were evil or satanic forces. And so Banquo is being very cautious in what he takes from the prophecies. Okay. So function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what it is not. So starting to think about the AO2, the language and structure of this. The abstract nouns is something we can take from this. These abstract concepts, the function, the surmise, represent action versus thought, and symbolize internal struggle. So I should add, this is what Macbeth said. Macbeth feels paralyzed because he thinks too much and lives in his imagination, so much so that he never acts. This sets up his ambition and motivation to act. This is his response. When the witches leave, and they've left the witches, they've got their prophecies, this is Macbeth's response to the situation. The smothering. So this idea that function, this internal struggle, this action, is smothered. Why have we used this sort of violent word, this violent verb? It's because it personifies it. The ability to act here is being personified, as being smothered. The verb has violent connotations to emphasize Macbeth's inner paralysis as imagination begins to overpower logic. This creates an atmosphere of suffocation and suffering to show how ambition is clouding his reason, to foreshadow how ambition will become a violent force leading to suffering and death. So this quote is a perfect example of how very early in the play, ambition is beginning to almost plague Macbeth, taking him over as a character. This idea of acting versus thought, because what's really being talked about here is head versus body. Macbeth feels compelled to act without actually thinking it through. And the personification of this, of the idea of our thoughts being smothered, is Macbeth is really saying, like, oh, he can't control his thoughts. He just really wants to act, which is a red flag. It's foreshadowing his violence again, that he's not thinking logically. He's simply driven almost like an innate response by his ambition to do violent things. So again, was it fate that is in charge of his downfall, or was he already a tyrannous person? And then finally, we can talk about this juxtaposition, the nothing is but what is not. Macbeth is detached from reality. The world around him feels very meaningless. He loves to live in his imagination and finds glory in what could be, in this case, becoming king. So the fact that he's just got this ambition or sorry, these prophecies from the witches confirming what he wants out of the world or what he wants from his life, highlights this conflict between the present and the future. Macbeth is overwhelmed by the witch's prophecies and by ambition, and this quote is a great example of that. This is the effect of the inciting incident of the structure of the story. This quote marks the turning point of Macbeth's character. Structurally, that's extremely important because it shows the audience the point at which ambition begins to take over Macbeth's character. We kind of saw it a few pages ago in terms of the prophecies instilled his ambition, but it's not until this moment that his ambition begins to take over his mind. So it links heavily to the Divine Right of Kings as Macbeth contemplates immoral thoughts such as overthrow the king. And his Hamartia is revealed. So this scene is extremely important in the context of the rest of the play. Okay, let me think. Have we got time for the next one? I think we might leave it there for today. There's two more scenes in which Macbeth appears in Act 1, but I think it's better to maybe explore scene 4 later on, next week. Right, has anyone got any questions for me to answer? Again, I'm going to say like last week, if you've got anything you want me to cover, by the way, please put it in the chat. I know last week people were asking about essay writing, hence the first session today. And again, if you missed that and you think it'd be useful going over how to structure an essay, I think it'll still be on YouTube or it should be on Zoom. But otherwise, power and conflict, yes. Do you mean like themes or poetry? Just clarify that, please. So like themes in Macbeth, power and conflict, or poetry? Okay. Poetry is a difficult one because there's so many poems and not everyone does the same ones, whereas most people do Macbeth. But yeah, I'll take that. I'll think about it. Because poetry does seem to confuse people. But yeah, I think let's leave this until next week. And we'll continue looking at Macbeth and we'll begin to break it down and look into Act 2. So I hope this was helpful. I'm sorry to cut this short, but I think it's better. But yes, if you've got any questions, I'll stay around for the next few minutes, answer them in the chat. But otherwise, have a lovely evening and I'll see you next week. Have a good week.